Well, thank you for coming out on a cool evening. And welcome to the first Tony Woiak History Festival of 2025. My name is Karen Novacek. I am on the board of the Washburn Heritage Association. As you are aware, we do the history festivals in conjunction with the Washburn Area Museum. And so it's two organizations in our community that collaborate to put on the 4 festivals that will occur during the winter, and then there will be 4 additional during the summer. To help support the festivals, it is dependent in part, certainly your contributions, and as you come in the door, help us, and also it is the membership of WHA. And so it is the beginning of the new year, and certainly an opportunity for you, if you are not currently a member, to consider membership of WHA. We will have information about membership in the back. For an individual, the membership is $20. For a family, it's $30. And obviously, there are dollar amounts above that, then you can contribute. You can be a patron, a business, a benefactor. The sky's the limit. But if you are thinking about that, and I would urge you to think about it, one of our missions, important missions of WHA, is to tell the story. Tell the story of Washburn and the surrounding area. The history festivals do that, and we do it in a number of other ways. And I don't know if Ginny was planning to talk about the book.
No.
Okay, well, let me also plug the book, because we just have told the story, a big story in 200 pages, that the kiosk committee of WHA has worked on over 2 years, and we together published the book in November, had a book launch, and books are for sale in the back of the room. They are $35, and I guarantee if you have been in Washburn for 5 or 10 years or beyond, you're going to see somebody, or you're going to see a picture of a building, and you're going to say, I know that. So it is a story. It's a story. It's called The Spirit of Washburn. And it's the story of Washburn, the surrounding area, and it's a great book. It's a great book. So they are in the back that are available for sale, $35. And again, I urge you to think about membership. WHA is busy with lots of different activities, and we would encourage you to think about that and talk to us as you leave this evening, and we can help you understand how to become a member. So thank you. And Ginny Peterson will now introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And welcome again, everybody. It's so good to see your faces again and be gathered for the beginning of another festival season. And thank you for coming back again and again. It shows you've got some enthusiasm for the stories we're telling, and that warms our heart. In fact, Bob Mack he's not here tonight, but he had to email me about he's a speaker for one of our later programs this year, and he used those very words. He said, it warms my heart that it's been 14 years and people still want to come and hear stories. And it does, so thank you. And we want to thank the Harbor Table for they do all the setup for us and have some of the equipment here, the screen. And so we appreciate them hosting us. And I also always want to remember to thank Andrew Grimm, who's not even with a little bit of a cold, or maybe even more. He said, I'll come, I'll get everything set up. He's our videotaper. And all the programs that are done are videotaped, and then at any future time you can go to the Washburn Heritage Association website and view those for free. So we appreciate his abilities to do it, and also his willingness to help out. So thanks, Andrew. So I want to remind you of one other kind of housekeeping thing. when we bought all of our new equipment last year, we were so excited to have visuals and sound that actually works and people can hear and see. And at the very first night, as people always did before, the speaker would finish and then people would come forward because they wanted to add something or ask a question afterwards, which was just really great. But we kind of panicked because there were wires running back and forth connected to speakers and other equipment, and we were concerned. So the routine now is not to come forward, but we're going to ask our speaker if he could go to the back of the room after he's done. It also helps us pack things up so we can be home sooner too. So that's just a routine that I want to remind you of. So now our speaker is Mr. Brian Finstad. And I didn't know much about Brian, but when our committee was putting the season together, David Bratley said, "Oh my gosh, he's such a wonderful speaker, and he's got a story to tell about the sand barons." And so I couldn't find out too much from Brian. I said, "Can you give me some biographical information?" I don't know if he was being shy, but he didn't share. Then I went online and I did find some things out. So one of the articles I found, it was from a few years back, but it was a wonderful story. It was, I think, in the Superior Press or one of the papers up there. And Brian grew up in Gordon, Wisconsin. Raise your hand if you know where Gordon is. Most of you. If you're going towards Superior, you get off the highway before you get there, and it's south a ways. And there was a fire tower that was going to be demolished that had always stood in Gordon. And Mr. Finstad and some associates got really riled up because they didn't want it to go away. It was part of the history and the past in Gordon. So I guess it got saved, and I'll let Mr. Finstad add to that or you can look that story up online if you'd like. It's a great one, but it got saved. And I think the people here appreciate that our organizations, the Heritage Association and the museum, the area museum, are about saving things and preserving things and remembering. And so I think we're kind of kindred spirits as far as that goes. I also know that he is currently a member of the Douglas County Historical Society and the Gordon Historical Society. He's also on the Superior Planning Commission, and he also is working on something he's going to tell you a little more about, and that is what, after he shares the past of the sands, the sand baron area, he's going to tell you a little bit about some ideas he has for sharing that story. So all of us are anxious to hear you, Brian. So I'm going to stop talking and just say welcome, and it's all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's a cold night out. Good, nice night to settle in and just listen to a story, I guess. So my name is Brian Finstad. I just wanted to add, so my family background actually goes back to Barnes, so in Bayfield County. I'm a great-great-grandson of George Barnes that founded Barnes. So my great-great-grandfather would have come to Washburn quite frequently for meetings. He was also on the county board, I forgot to mention that, and president of the Iron River Bank. So that was came in 1888 and was here until sometime in the 1920s. So anyway, my family was in Barnes, and then I grew up in Gordon, both which fall within the Northwest Sands. If you're familiar with the Northwest Sands ecological landscape, it's this wide swath of glacial outwash. If you're driving and you see where there's lots of jack pines, that's when you're in the sand barrens, and I'll get more to that. But I'm gonna talk about a story that probably most of your stories are very history oriented. This one is sort of a little bit of a blend of history and geology and ecology, and how they all kind of intersect and meet each other, sort of how the geology of this landscape affected the ecology of the landscape, and that affected how people used the landscape and how they traveled on the landscape over time. So there was a path that crossed the Northwest Sands ecological landscape, and most people in your region are familiar with it as the St. Croix Trail, because in this area it was the way to get to the St. Croix. In the St. Croix country, we call it the Bayfield Trail, because it was the way to get to Bayfield. And most people are familiar with it from this book that was published in the 1960s about William Gray Purcell and his childhood growing up at Island Lake and Barnes. And he named the book St. Croix Trail Country because the St. Croix Trail in his time would have been the main way to get anywhere. How many of you are familiar with the book or know the term St. Croix Trail? Okay, so a few, not too many, but that's good. You'll know after tonight. So, let's see, to kick it off, I'm going to start with just a little bit about geology. So these are the different lobes of the glaciers of this area. And one way that I really came to understand the Northwest Sands ecological landscape is what happens with a melting snowbank is very similar to what happens with a glacier, just on a smaller scale. And if you're familiar with when a snowbank melts, and do you ever see those little rivulets that come out from under it and they wash sand? And you'll just see like these little sand outwashes under a melting snowbank. So these glaciers were doing that on a really, really big scale. So if you look at the Superior Lobe and the Chippewa Lobe and see that gap there, that gap, as it melted, receded upwards, and that gap got filled in with all kinds of sand washing out within that gap, filling it in and creating the Northwest Sands ecological landscape. So the sands in that area go hundreds of feet deep. This is a map of fire-dependent vegetation. So you can see where the sand barrens are by where the fire-dependent vegetation is. Because the sands were hundreds of feet deep, they were very drought-prone. They would just dry out very easily, and then would get swept by wildfire. So the vegetation within the Northwest Sands is very, very different. And you'll notice a stark difference after tonight that I pointed it out. When you hit the Northwest Sands, things change to like scrub oak and jack pine. You sort of lose the heavier, maples and oaks, or the white oaks. The scrub oaks are still there. But the vegetation changes a lot. So obviously Chequamegon Bay is up there, and you can see how it makes that conduit down to the St. Croix. So when it was swept by wildfire, this landscape would have been very, very open, similar to today, the Moqua Barrens near you is maintained to show what that original habitat was like. Before fire suppression, it was a very open brush prairie and savanna type landscape. So this is a picture of how historically the landscape would have looked. That area of northern Wisconsin was not the giant pine forest that we think of. We think of northern Wisconsin, the giant pine forest and the lumberjacks, and that was all true in many areas, but in the areas in red, it would have historically looked like this. And this is actually a picture much further south. This is the Namaquagan Barrens, which is kind of down closer to Danbury. But that's how the vegetation historically would have looked. It turned into forest after fire suppression. After fire suppression, then the forest grew up. So that's just to give a little bit of perspective on what the landscape looked like. So it was very high, dry, and open land, very, very open. So getting to how people historically traversed the landscape, how many of you are aware of the Brule-St. Croix portage? So the Brule and St. Croix nearly have the same source, which this is the Brule, and that's the St. Croix. And by portaging between the two, you could get from Lake Superior to the St. Croix watershed, you could get to the Mississippi. And it's sort of very well known in history about the Brule-St. Croix portage, but we almost overtell the story of the Brule-St. Croix portage because it was primarily recorded by white men who journaled. And white men who journaled would stick to waterways no matter how difficult because they were afraid of getting lost. But you couldn't take the Brule-St. Croix portage in the winter, you couldn't take it when the water was too high, you couldn't take it when the water was too low. If you got out to the south shore of Lake Superior, you could end up windbound for days. So there was a land route alternative to the Brule-St. Croix portage, and when there were native guides present, they often took the trail. And so again, being high, dry, and open land and on that perfect conduit, there was a footpath that crossed over crossed over the Northwest Sands. And again, this is an outline of the Northwest Sands, and it sort of shows that perfect trajectory. And this is, a picture of a path crossing the Barrens, and you can see when it's high, dry, and open land, it's just a very easy way to get across. And there would have been a lot of interest in going back and forth between the Mississippi watershed and the Lake Superior watershed. Being Madeline Island was sort of the hub of the fur trade and the missionaries and early American settlement, and the lower St. Croix was some of the earliest American settlement, and Fort Snelling was down there. There was lots of travel back and forth between the St. Croix and Lake Superior. So this is a map this is actually Joseph Nicolet's map it was published in 1843, I think it was from notes from traveling in 1837. And I just outlined it in blue, but that's the trail that went across the Northwest Sands. Obviously you can see Chequamegon Bay up there. And he was heading down towards St. Paul. Actually, the map goes all the way down there. I grew up in Gordon, which is, Gordon's about right there. And Gordon's sort of the jumping off point where it leaves the St. Croix Valley and just goes across the sands where there's just nothing but sands and no waterway up to here, up to Chequamegon Bay. The trail was called many different things. This was from a sketch map, I think, that was given to Henry Schoolcraft. A voyageur had sketched a map and given it to him. It says Carte des Grands Chemins. And chemin basically means footpath in French. Then you can see in a little bit in pencil it says Great Trail to Fall-au-Vent. The St. Croix was called the Fall-au-Vent country. Fall-au-Vent was what the French called wild rice. So the upper St. Croix has a lot of wild rice and was called the Fall-au-Vent country. It was also called Trail to LaPointe. There's so many names this trail was called. Bayfield Trail, St. Croix Trail, Trail from Long Island Bay to St. Peter's. St. Peter's was an early settlement down by St. Paul. Like I said, Trail to LaPointe, so many different names that it was called over time. This is actually from the original government survey map. They actually, from Gordon to Bayfield, they have it filled in on the original government survey map, so you can know exactly where it is, which is pretty cool. So I guess I'm going to talk a lot about Gordon because I'm from Gordon, and Gordon was a very central point on the trail. And even though Gordon seems like a very distant place to you guys, Gordon actually would have had a lot of connection with this region during the time when this trail would have been sort of the prominent way to get anywhere. And that'll probably make more sense as I go through the presentation. This is Chief Gabamabe. He was the Ojibwe chief of the area that's now the Gordon Flowage, which is sort of a widening of the river that now is dammed, but even in his time there was a natural rock obstruction, so there was some slack water and there was wild rice and there was a native village. And he actually came from LaPointe and settled down near Gordon and then returned to LaPointe and died there of smallpox, I believe around 1854. So he was really a very prominent chief of the Upper St. Croix, signed a lot of the early treaties, and like I said, there was a lot of connection between the Upper St. Croix and Chequamegon Bay, and it was largely because of this trail. This is another very early character, Alexander Ramsey, president of the American Fur Company. He would have been another early user of this trail. He journaled about when he was going to Pekegama, which is in Minnesota. If any of you know where the reconstructed fur post is down by Pine City, he was heading down there, and he actually took the Brule St. Croix portage because he had some canoes with lots of cargo and whatnot. But he sent, in the memoirs or whatever, it says he sent Indian runners to Pekegama across the trail because they could arrive there quicker. And then they could sort of announce that he was coming or let people know he was coming. So even besides people physically traveling, the trail was also just used for a communication link. And, one other thing of interest with this picture. I put the photo next to it as sort of a reminder of the early European settlement that came into the area, the earliest European contact with the area. They would have been aware of this trail if not using this trail. And even though it's sort of a, how would I say, sort of a surprise to us that this landscape, like the Moqua Barrens, is vast and wide and open and not forested. It actually felt very familiar to them. A lot of them journaling would have, one that referred to it reminded them of the moorlands in Scotland. And moorlands basically is a pine barrens habitat. And what's interesting is if you looked at the picture on the right, wouldn't you think that looks like the Moqua Barrens? That's actually in the Netherlands.
Oh.
So, Europe had glaciers, and Europe had glacial outwash, and where there was glacial outwash in Europe, there were barrens, and where the barrens are, even though it's completely different plants, the plants are adapted to the same circumstances, and it's really surreal. I actually took this because I was biking out there, and it looks the same, and it even smells the same. Like, it's really surreal. You get out there and you think you're here. As European settlement increased in the area and the American Fur Company went bankrupt, one of the first things that really developed the trail was the carrying of U.S. mail. And obviously LaPointe was a very significant location. Lots of people need to communicate, like anywhere else, you need mail. And this trail would have been the conduit to, this trail going to St. Paul would have been the conduit to really the closest American settlement that they could really get news and mail and whatnot. So it became an official United States mail route as early as 1837, which is really early. That's before statehood. Clement Beaulieu was the first one to carry the mail, and it was at first under contract with the American Fur Company. And then what happened is after the American Fur Company went bankrupt, a lot of the men that had previously been employed by the American Fur Company, their next employment was carrying mail on the trail. This trail and other trails. If you're familiar with the John Grease, sled dog marathon, John Bear Grease was a figure on the North Shore who was, formerly fur trade employed, and he was Métis. Most of these men were all Métis of mixed ancestry with Ojibwe mothers and fur trade employed fathers, and worked in the fur trade. And the reason that they would have gone to mail carrying is because it was such a logical, transferable skill, because they were used to carrying large, heavy packs long distances. That's what they would have done during the fur trade, and these guys were not, they were carrying mail in packs on foot. So the trail at this point was just a trail. It wasn't developed for wagon travel or anything else. This, on the bottom, I think was a notice I found in a St. Paul magazine, and it was, I think that was around sometime in the 1840s, but it says from the Falls of St. Croix, which is Taylor's Falls today, to LaPointe, 180 miles and back once every 2 weeks. So that's the frequency of the mail. And then it talks about when they would leave and when they would arrive. The guy in the picture, actually, I should mention him too, that's Charles Dingley. Charles Dingley also, as a child, would have lived on LaPointe on Madeline Island. And then his sister married Antoine Gordon, who later came to Gordon and founded our town of Gordon. And then he lived out the rest of his life in Gordon. And most of the early Gordon residents came from LaPointe. Even though that seems like it's a community far, far away, it was all of these LaPointers that left LaPointe when, after the collapse of the fur trade and sort of economic opportunity was no longer there, they moved far into the interior because the trail was really a conduit of economic opportunity and family ties also. There were probably many different complex reasons for why they went there, but most early settlement at Gordon came from LaPointe. This is an interesting article I found. There would have been, different ways that you would have traveled over the trail in different seasons. And so in the winter, obviously you could go on foot with snowshoes, but sled dogs would have been a much quicker way, I would think. So this is actually a dog train that went to St. Paul from up here, from Chequamegon Bay. And the name is typed wrong. It says Julius Ostman, but it's Julius Austrian, if any of you are familiar with LaPointe, early LaPointe history. He was a very big figure. But it talks about him being accompanied by Mr. Roy, that'd be Vincent Roy, if you're familiar with who Vincent Roy was. And basically it talks about them going down to St. Paul and describes the train of dogs and, the baggage that they had, and it was very, very difficult. And at the very end, I love that it basically culminates in they brought no news of any importance. So then what happened is Bayfield was founded. And once Bayfield was founded, the trail really developed and changed. Bayfield was founded by a very prominent Minnesota senator, Senator Henry Rice. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Henry Rice. And once Bayfield was founded, there was a real need to get supplies and settlers up to the founding of this new city. And the focus really shifted to the mainland from LaPointe on Madeline Island. And they really had a lot of interest in developing the trail. So that's when the trail first got developed for wagon travel. It was interests from Bayfield that developed the trail down to the Namakagon, and then interests of the lumber companies from the lower St. Croix developed the lower trail up to that point. So this is actually something I found in the New York Herald, and this is also a really interesting point too, is that you think of it as, well, it was just this little trail that locally went through the woods. But in terms of westward expansion of the nation, this was the first time that there was really public transportation, because there were stagecoaches that ran on it, public transportation that went from the greatest of the Great Lakes to the greatest of the rivers, and connecting the nation together between those two really great significant things. So when you think about it, there would have been national interest in this. Today you can still find places where you can see the trail out in the woods, and it's just, oh, there's some ruts in the ground there. And then to think that those ruts in the ground there were making news in New York, it's pretty amazing. So this is about, I think, the first wagon. Yeah, a splendid line of 4-horse post coaches, starting at St. Paul and went to Bayfield. And I love too, it says, where a few years ago, white man had never trod. They just like to exaggerate, that's not true. So this is Henry Rice, and Henry Rice formed the Minnesota Stage Company. So 1959 is when they started running stagecoaches. And again, the primary interest is to get settlers and supplies up to Bayfield. And then they would actually bring barrels of fish from Lake Superior back to St. Paul. So fish here could get to market. Obviously, I mean, how else would you do it? There were no railroads then. There were no other roads then. This was really the first road. And what's interesting about Henry Rice is that he was a very powerful senator from Minnesota, so it was a line of the Minnesota Stage Company that came up here. And there's a lot written about Minnesota stagecoach history, but it never mentions this line because the authors aren't aware of it, because they aren't looking for a Minnesota Stage Company line outside of Minnesota. And then there's a lot written about Wisconsin stagecoach history, but it never mentions this line because it doesn't connect into the Wisconsin stagecoach system in any way. So there really is nothing that's ever been comprehensively written about this, which is interesting. You just have to read, you really have to scour everything that's ever been written about the region, and then just glean pieces of it here and there is really how you research this route. So then we get to Antoine and Sarah Gordon. So these are the founders of my hometown of Gordon, and they came from up here, and they were one of the first people that lived and settled on what is now Washburn. So if you're familiar with Memorial Park in Washburn, that was Antoine and Sarah Gordon's farm. They had a subsistence farm there. And if you're familiar with, in Memorial Park, there's areas with big, big trees, and then there's like a wide open center. That wide open center is actually Antoine and Sarah's subsistence farm field. And when you look at the original government surveyor, he draws in the opening like where their farm field is. And if you look at a map today, it's the exact same shape. And it just amazes me that after like all of those years, I mean, this would be from the 1850s until now, that opening is still there. And to be honest, before I knew that, I used to drive in there, and I love trees, and I honestly would probably have thought, geez, I wish they would plant more trees. And now I think that's really neat. So they were both Métis, had fur trade employed fathers and Ojibwe mothers. They both lived at LaPointe on Madeline Island, but weren't born there. Sarah was actually born on the St. Croix down by the Yellow River. Antoine was born at Sandy Lake in Minnesota, but then both moved to LaPointe very, very young because their parents worked for the American Fur Company and lived most of their life at LaPointe, then moved over to their farm at what is now Washburn, and then in coordination with Henry Rice moved out to Gordon. And the reason they moved out to what now is Gordon is the stage line needed to have stopping places along the way. So periodically they would need to have places where people could stop, they could rest, they could get a meal, the horses could get hay, and they usually had these stopping places at waterpoint crossings. So Gordon is where the trail crossed the Eau Claire River, the river that comes from the Eau Claire Lakes into the St. Croix, and all of the land patents for, let me see, there was a stopping place at Moose Lake, which now Moose Lake is just a pond sort of in the National Forest. And then at Island Lake and Barnes, Antoine's Place in Gordon, the crossing of the Namakagon, all of those parcels were pulled on the same day in 1860 for the stopping places. And that's Antoine and Sarah on the porch there, and that's their stopping place in Gordon. So they moved from here, from the location, Memorial Park, out to Gordon, and then a lot of early LaPointers followed them. And then that's how our settlement began. This is something that's really interesting, probably a lot of you are familiar with. So there was this delegation that went to go meet with President Lincoln, and it was all of the chiefs and headmen of the Lake Superior Ojibwe sort of convened at LaPointe and then went to go meet with President Lincoln. And the way that they went, and the date on this is actually wrong, it's actually 1863, that's incorrect. But the way that they went was they took this trail down to St. Paul, and then they went south on the Mississippi to where the first railroad connected with the Mississippi, and then they went east to Washington, and by train, yep. And there's other delegations that went to Washington. Some of them went through the lakes, and some of them went one way and came back the other. I forget. Benjamin Armstrong's book always talks about the different delegations and the ways they traveled, but this delegation went down this trail. And what's interesting is the bridge over the Namakagon was being constructed, and the man doing it, Albert Stuntz, was journaling about its construction when the delegation came through, and he writes about the delegation coming through, so that's how we know the exact date that it was. So people moved and lived along this trajectory. So before we had highways and railroads that cut very north-south, how in Wisconsin we have, Wisconsin 35, Wisconsin 53, 27, 63, and they create these very north-south orientations, and all those communities are kind of lined up, and the railroads kind of line the communities up. If you erase all that from your mind, and you picture that people were historically traveling on this slanted axis, those communities were very, very connected, and you'll find, even in cemeteries, old cemeteries, you'll find people from different communities along the way. You'll see a lot of the same last names, because people had relationships all along the way, and they even themselves would move all along the way. So this is Nancy Gein, and she lived at Taylor's Falls, and then she moved up to Gordon, and then she moved up to Bayfield, and then she moved back to Taylor's Falls. And people, they didn't just travel along that trajectory, but their family connections, their relationships, and maybe even themselves where they lived would sort of move and go back and forth up and down that trajectory. She's a very interesting character. I could give a whole presentation on her life. I won't go into it, but her sons actually, today on the Brule River, her sons were early guides on the Brule. There's a Gein Slough, and if you know Little Joe Rapids and Big Joe Rapids on the Brule, that's named after her son Joseph. So I could give a whole presentation on Nancy Gein. She's fascinating. So then what happened is the railroads came into being, and this is the depot in Gordon, and you can see this is where the railroad cut through a hill, and you can see that's all pure sand. That's just how sandy the sand barrens are. And another interesting thing is this tree is still there, it's on my friend's yard actually. But it wasn't always all open, because sometimes red pines would grow to the point where they were above the level of where the fire would go, and then they would be called red pine savanna, where the branches were high up enough that the fire would just go underneath it. And the fires also weren't the raging forest fires that we think of today, because the fires were going across the sand barrens about every 5 years. So it was really quick light grass fires. And it took me a long time to understand that. There's a woman who journaled taking the stagecoach from St. Paul up to Bayfield, and she writes about encountering a forest fire. And then she writes about that they just continued on and drove through it. And I was like, wait, what? There's a forest fire, how did you just continue through it? But it's because these were really light, quick grass fires, because the fuel wouldn't accumulate if it was burning every 5 years. So after the railroads came into being, the railroads would bring lumbermen up to the upper St. Croix. And even though the sand barrens weren't logged, obviously, because there really wasn't heavy timber, there would be timber sort of off of the edges of the sand barrens. So the railroads would bring lumbermen up to Gordon, and then the sand barrens were great for tote roads, just like they were for stagecoaches, because it was high, dry, and open land to go to where the timber was, and then kind of go off the edges of the sand barrens into where they needed to get timber. And this is now a little bit of my story. This is how my family came here. My great-great-grandfather, George Barnes, came here as a lumberman, actually first over in Drummond. And then as he was sort of roaming around, he discovered the area around Barnes and really liked it. They first lived at Island Lake. They were domestic help for the Grays, who were a wealthy family that had a cabin on the island. And then they moved off of the island and homesteaded. And their life really follows the trajectory of how settlement went on the Northwest Sands. So they moved off and homesteaded. So then they had their log shanty. And then, oh, this is another just interesting photo. Going back to Island Lake, if any of you are familiar with the book, A Little History of My Forest Life by Eliza Morrison. Eliza Morrison also worked at Island Lake Camp as domestic help for the Grays. So she and my great-great-grandmother were good friends, and so their kids were friends. So this is a picture of the families together. And then that's my great-grandmother, my dad's grandma. And that's my great-great-grandmother. And that's two Morrison boys back there. And George Barnes right there. And the other two girls, and Martha, these three, died when their homestead shanty burnt down. So then the next generation really moved up, and you go from the log homestead shanty to you have the big American white four-square farmhouse. They were thinking they were really moving up, but you can see the land they're on is pine barrens because you can obviously see the jack pines around. And if you look at the ages of those jack pines, this is after the barrens had been kind of tamed by settlement. So these are young jack pines that grew up because the forest fires weren't going on for a while. And then you get into the Dust Bowl of the 30s, and the land had other ideas for what it was going to do. People thought they were going to tame the land, and it was going to be like all-American homestead, and they were going to have farms, and the land just had different ideas. So in the 30s, everybody knows about the Dust Bowl. It was very, very dry. Wildfires just swept across the Northwest Sands in the 30s. I think almost every bit of it was burned at one time or another and wiped out lots and lots of homesteads. Their homestead wasn't wiped out, but George Barnes had a lot of land valuable land for timber, and the timber was all burnt off, and the farming went belly up, and so they went bankrupt and lost everything to foreclosure. And the farmhouse is still there, but every year it's just there a little bit less. But one of the interesting things is the large amounts of land that went tax forfeit from the homesteads going bust is why we have so much public forest land within the Northwest Sands today. So that's somewhat interesting. So during that era when the homesteads were going bust is sort of this golden era of conservation that we had in northern Wisconsin. These are pictures around Gordon. But that's when like the CCC and the WPA came in, and they were building parks and buildings and dams. And so this is Mooney Dam on the Eau Claire Lakes, the Gordon Fire Tower, the one she mentioned that we saved. And that's the clubhouse of our bird sanctuary. Our bird sanctuary is near Gordon. It's our version of your Moko Barrens. It's a Barrens habitat wildlife area that was developed for sharp-tailed grouse habitat. The sharp-tailed grouse really have to have open Barrens habitat to survive. So the earliest efforts to preserve Barrens habitat in some areas was related to saving the sharp-tailed grouse. The other interesting thing that happened sort of in this golden era of conservation is they were very interested in, when they were building all these state parks and national parks and things like that, they were really interested in sort of these very folksy tales of the explorers and the pioneers and whatnot. And there was this era where they were very interested in this trail. So again, this is Gordon, but you can see they put the trail in dots. It didn't still exist then, but it says Indian Trail, St. Croix to LaPointe, and put these Indians in shooting at the deer. It was just this very folksy, story that they were really interested in. And you'll see a lot of maps where they would draw in the trail, and they had a curiosity and an interest in it, which in itself is interesting. That's just a closer up of that. LaPointe Trail Historic. And of course, it didn't go to Hudson Bay, but what they're referring to as the Hudson Bay Company. They were just terrible historians. They just thought anything related, they know that fur traders took this trail, and they thought anything related to the fur trade must be the Hudson Bay Company, which didn't have anything to do with this trail. So in the 30s, people were very, very interested in the trail, and then that kind of died down. People weren't interested in it for a long time. And then after the St. Croix Trail Company book came out, then people again became interested in it because of the book. And in the 70s, there was this little bit of resurgence of interest in the trail. So this is a bunch of guys in barns that went out in the 70s to go search for pieces of the trail. And it's actually really fun. If you know where it is, you can find it. When I was a kid, it was kind of a pastime, and you can follow it. And then, there would be development or a homestead farm, or they furrowed for a pine plantation. But you kind of know the trajectory, and you go around, then you find it again, and you follow it for a while. Now you can do it from home looking at LiDAR, which is interesting, but it's still out there, and you can still find it. If you see, right through here, I don't know if you can see that depression. It's really hard to photograph, but if you were standing right there, it'd be really, really obvious. And, so just kind of going through the evolution of what happened with the land, after the fires went away, it grew up into forest. So I've mentioned that several times now, and this is just a picture to sort of show how that open landscape, quickly grew up with jack pine seedlings and became forest. And then this is the sharp-tailed grouse. As the barrens were converting into forest, the sharp-tailed grouse were quickly disappearing, and they realized, mostly driven by people that wanted to hunt sharp-tailed grouse, they realized we need to have areas where we can still have sharp-tailed grouse. So that's when areas like the Moco Barrens were formed, the bird sanctuary around Gordon, Namakagon Barrens, which is down somewhat close to the confluence of the Namakagon and the St. Croix, and then also Crex Meadows. Most people know of Crex Meadows because of its wetlands, but the upland areas of Crex are Barrens habitat. And so it really, the protection of what we do have left of the Barrens really revolved around this bird. And of course, they're maintained with fire. So here's just a picture of a control burn out at the Namakagon Barrens. They go through in the spring and the fall and light the barrens on fire. And it's really funny on every community Facebook post or Facebook group when they do it, there's always some people up in arms about thinking they're destroying the habitat. And they don't realize that this is maintaining the historic habitat. And actually trees are environmental devastation in some areas. And actually barrens are considered a globally rare and imperiled habitat. So it's very significant and very special and needs protection. So with the wildlife areas, friends groups formed. So this is Friends of the Namakagon Barrens, which I'm also a member of. I'm a member of way too many things. But I'm not on the board of this one, I'm just a member. And this was probably 2015, 2014, somewhere around there. And this is when we went out to go look for areas of the trail on the Namakagon Barrens wildlife area to see if we could find where it was. And it's there, it's beautiful. And I've come to realize that the Barrens habitat areas are the places where the trail imprint is always going to continue to exist because those areas don't get developed. Even since I was a kid, just with logging is probably the biggest one. Just, after logging goes through and machinery is driven over an area and then they furrow it afterwards, it just obliterates the traces of the trail. So even in my lifetime, the areas that you could see the trail have diminished greatly, but the wildlife areas are where you can really find it intact for long stretches and they will probably remain. So, so these different wildlife areas have auto tours. So this is the auto tour for the Moco Barrens. Namakagon Barrens has its own auto tour, and you drive around the wildlife area, and it has little points of interest that you stop at and learn something. And so when I first joined the board of the bird sanctuary, which is one of the Barrens habitat wildlife areas, which I should mention, all of them have a friends group except Moqua. And if any of you guys want to form one, you should, because it really needs one. All the others do. It just needs somebody to get it started. So they all have these internal auto tours. And when I first joined the board, they talked about creating a trail, an auto trail that goes across the Northwest Sands and connects all the wildlife areas together. That somebody could, for great recreation fun, drive across the Northwest Sands and see all these wildlife areas and learn all about the Northwest Sands. And most of the people that have been involved were, somehow interested in the geology or ecology aspect of it, or the sharp-tailed grouse. And I'm just a history geek by nature. And when they developed this idea, I thought, wow, this is basically following the historic trail, because it's doing the same thing. It's following the Northwest Sands. And the route that they had proposed was nearly identical to, if you wanted to take the modern roads that most closely approximate the old stagecoach route, that was the route they had laid out. So then I got very involved and said, well, let's not just tell stories that are geological and ecological. Let's tell stories about the Northwest Sands that are geological, ecological, historical, and cultural. And so it's been sort of percolating in the background for a lot of years. We've had community engagement sessions. One was on your end. A lot have happened to the south, but on your end there was one in Barnes. There's been 2 at the Great Lakes Visitors Center, one at Madeline Island, and then I'm here telling you guys about it tonight. So this was an early rendition, the red line there, of the auto trail. It's developed a lot since then, but it's still in the works. And the whole concept of auto trails is kind of historic and interesting in itself. There was, when motoring with cars became a recreational activity, when people first started to get cars, there was this little period of time where there was a boom in interest in auto trails. And they would take existing roads and they would give it a name, and sometimes they'd give it little symbols they put along the way to follow. And they're really kitschy and really fun. And in Minnesota, these are just some of the early auto trails that would have been in Minnesota. And we figured, well, what do we call this? We can't call it a scenic byway, because that has a real specific designation by the state. And people's expectations of a scenic byway are kind of nice paved roads. And this auto trail really takes into some backcountry. So we're calling it the Northwest Sands Auto Trail. And this next picture is just fun, because you'll know a couple of these people. But Amber, I know, has spoken here before. And then Leo is like one of the smartest people I know about local regional history. And Dennis and Cleo are from LCO. Cleo's family is deep roots in Gordon. So Cleo's family would have been early users of the trail themselves. And me and Cleo's families probably have known each other for 100 years. But last fall, we just went out to practice drive part of the auto trail and stop at, old sites of this route that no longer exist, but that we're just trying to bring awareness to, and we really had just kind of a wacky fun day with it. So I'm just leaving this with a picture of wood lilies, just because they're a great representation of the Northwest Sands. They're a lily that blooms in the early summer, and you really only find wood lilies in the sand barrens and nowhere else. So that is the story of the Northwest Sands, sort of through time and culminating in the project of the Northwest Sands Auto Trail. Like I said, it's still in development, but we actually got a grant from Wisconsin Coastal Management to get a website developed. And we've really been wanting to have a place that people can go to and get information, and we can point to, and they can figure out how to go on it themselves. But for tonight, I printed off just a few things of our rough work in progress map. Not rough, it's come a long ways, but it's still a work in progress. And my niece is actually going to pass them out. There probably isn't enough for everybody here, so if you're in a group, if you just want to raise a hand if you want one. It's a map of the whole route, a map of kind of zoomed in on just Bayfield County, and then the front page shows the Northwest Sands and the wildlife areas, so you can kind of get an idea of what it's trying to connect together. And that is my story. So I see a bunch of hands.
Great story. I'm going to ask if you have something, and it's nice. I love this part because everybody gets to hear from one another, and we can share stories and comments. So that's what my microphone is for, and we'll be taking. I'll take it to you, and that way your voice is not just heard by Brian, but everybody gets to hear the question you're asking. So, did you have somebody that you would select it here?
Lorraine had her hand up.
Oh, good.
I'm trying to remember which map it was that you put up of where the trail came out at Lake Superior.
You know, as soon as you raised your hand, I realized I'd skipped over that part because I know you'd be interested. Yeah. So when it got close to Chequamegon Bay, it actually, and this is nice that I'm actually in a room of people that understand this end, because usually I'm talking about this down in the St. Croix end and they don't know this area that well. But it branched and reached the bay in 3 different areas. So one was near the mouth of Boyd's Creek, and then one was at the mouth of the Sioux River, and then after Bayfield was founded, they moved the one from the mouth of the Sioux River to Pikes Creek. And the reason is because along the shore, you wouldn't have to cross over through the wetlands around Pikes Creek. So, yeah. As soon as I saw your hand, I knew you were going to ask that. I'm sorry.
So in this area, the northern area.
So, like in our area, are there places that we could find the trail up in the Barrens?
Yeah, in the Mopo Barrens, there's areas where you can still see the trail, and there's somebody in the room that knows where they are. Oh, there he is. Yep.
Yeah, it's, I used to, when I was young, I used to be able to drive the trail, and I would drive it from the Muckle Barrens, and I could go all the way to the Sioux River. Oh, here.
I got it.
Oh, okay. And so, yeah, it's, and I go out there a lot. I've been trying to find other parts of it because it's grown in so bad now. And there's been so much logging going on that they've really scarred it up bad. So it would be fun to have other people out there just really looking for it. And like I said, I was able to drive it, so it was that good. I had a Jeep. So anybody is interested, yeah, I'd love to have them around, and we'll go out there and look. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Question. Go ahead.
Would there be a designation for this as a, state park or, some kind of state thing or national thing?
Right now we're trying to just make people aware of it and get it on a website and sort of bring awareness to it and develop it conceptually. There is a concept of a national historic trail, and if you Google that, it seems like a good fit because it tells a national story. It has native origins and used by fur traders and used by missionaries and used by early settlers, and it really paralleled sort of all of the stories of a larger region. But the process for that is like congressional designation, or it's something so big and so out there. I think the first thing is just making people aware of it and just locally having fun with it. Going out with groups of people and just experiencing it like our little wacky fall outing that we did, and just getting people out and enjoying it. And where it goes in the future, I have no idea. In my mind, it's significant enough that it could be part of the National Historic Trail system, but that's way beyond me.
When you were talking about this, it reminded me of the Natchez Trace. A lot of those features, absolutely. Are there sections of this that are closed off because it's trespassing?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, so
yeah.
that would,
Yeah, and you wouldn't, when I say a National Scenic Trail, I mean the auto trail, the modern roads that most closely approximate it, could get some sort of designation because you're learning about the historic trail, but you're really not on it. You are on it in some places, but mostly you're weaving back and forth around it on the modern roads that most closely approximate it. There's a few stretches of road where you are actually on it. Webster Road in Barnes, Bayfield Road in Gordon. The main street of Gordon is actually part of this trail. And there's very, very few places that it's actual modern road today. The wildlife areas are the places where there's the longest contiguous visible sections that you could walk, but they're not improved as hiking trails at this point. That's something I wouldn't mind developing too. But it's really fun after a control burn, especially when all the vegetation is burnt off and it's sort of that moonscape. That's when you can really see it and easily walk across it, and that's a lot of fun.
I just wanted to let you know that the most common last name in northern Bayfield County is Gordon.
Oh, I was going to mention that. I figured a lot of you probably know Gordons, and those. So Antoine went to found Gordon, but he had a number of brothers that stayed back here. So there's a lot of Gordons in this area, and those are descended from Antoine Gordon's brothers.
The third page has another trail going towards the Swallowing Bay. Can you explain what that is?
So,
Other trail.
let me see here. I got to refresh my memory of what this is. So this is actually good. So the red dotted line shows the historic trail, and it shows, as I was telling Lorraine, about the 3 different branches that went to the mouth of Boyd's Creek, the mouth of Sioux River, and then the mouth of Pikes Creek. This other trail that kind of goes across here, that's the North Country National Scenic Trail. And our map maker has different layers that turn off and turn on. It's a very sophisticated map, way more techie than I am. I'm just not that techie. And so when this map was printed, he had the National Trail layer turned on. So that's not part of our route, it just is showing where our route is in relation to the North Country National Scenic Trail.
Any more questions? Here's one from Donna.
The community that's called Mokwa, I lived there for a while, and we always referred to the Barrens. We didn't hear the name Mokwa, which is surprising, or not surprising, but very interesting. And are you aware of what Mokwa means?
Bear.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was named when they put the railroad through, and one of the Native Americans working on the railroad saw a bear and he yelled, Mokwa, Mokwa, and then Mishi Mokwa means a baby bear.
And the reason that I knew it meant bear is because in Gordon there's some trout ponds that are called Mishimokwa trout ponds.
Thank you.
Or
Any
water.
more? Yes, David.
It's on the St. Croix Trail up where the Moose Lake Stagecoach place was. A little bit north of that was also one room school called Arbutus. And we are still looking to find the exact spot where that was. So any help we could get with that would be excellent.
So David just mentioned 2 really interesting things. One, if you're not familiar with Moose Lake Station was where there's a little pond named Moose Lake that's just way out in the Barrens. There's nothing that you would look at of significance there today. And maybe some of you visited one of Amarin's talks, because Amarin talks about this. But this little pond at Moose Lake is the junction where the road to Bayfield, the road to Superior, the road to Gordon, and the road to Ashland all came together. So it was this major, major hub. And there was a city that was platted there that never came to be. It was just a paper town. And they even had started printing money for the bank that was going to be there in this fictitious town that never existed. So that's an interesting about Moose Lake. The interesting thing that you mentioned about Arbutus is, if you read enough pioneer accounts, Arbutus is this little tiny flower that's very fragrant. And there's so many flowers that are beautiful. There's wild roses, there's the wood lily, there's so many flowers that are beautiful. But if you read pioneer accounts, they were absolutely obsessed with the arbutus. There is almost no pioneer account that you read and they don't mention the arbutus flower, and they never mention any of the other flowers around here. They were just obsessed about that one flower. And it can be this area, it can be down by Gordon, it can be down by St. Croix Falls. Everywhere the pioneers were across this region, they were obsessed with the arbutus and just ignored all other flowers. And to me, that's fascinating.
Yes, here's a Jim.
I found it quite interesting that in the beginning of that trail, the mail was, took 2 weeks to get from Bayfield to St. Paul, and now that's only a week.
It's about 8 o'clock, and so we're going to wind things up, but I know that if you're able to stay a little longer, 2 weeks from tonight is the second Tony Woiak, and stop clapping, Dick, because I'm talking about you now. Because the presentation is actually one that was given in a kind of a small panel discussion during Preservation Month earlier this year in May, and well, last year in May. And so the focus of Preservation Month last year was the brownstone building that used to be called the Old Bank, and now it's the Cultural Center. And it's got a long and wonderful, exciting history. And so this panel discussion of Dick and also Karen Mackey, who her family owned it for a while, and also Steve Cotherman, who is the most recent director of the Cultural Center. And they just talked for about 45 minutes in the Cultural Center. There were maybe 25 people there, and it was such a great talk. We thought it needed to be repeated. So if you were there, you might want to come back, because now they're also having some visuals that are going to be with it, I believe. And also, it's just a good story, and you'll want to come back. So that's 2 weeks from tonight. And thank you one more time, and let's thank Brian one more time.
Thank you for having me.